the morning. 4 people were killed and 10 people seriously injured following clashes in Buenos Aires. General Pinochet of Chile has stepped up mass arrests following an assassination attempt on his life earlier this week in the capital Santiago. A policeman was shot dead and at least 3 other people injured yesterday in demonstrations in the city of Cochabamba against Bolivia's 5-day-old state of siege. Mexico faces a 40% loss in export earnings this year. President de la Madrid, speaking yesterday at a conference in the capital, predicted more losses and called for an immediate change in policy to rectify the situation there.
In the sprawling slums of Lima, capital of Peru, millions of women and men exist without running water or sanitation. Most have no job, scraping a living on the edge of the economy. It all seems a long way from a British high street and the familiar signs of the Black Horse, the Listening Bank, and the other major banks. But a chain of lending and debt stretches between the banks and their unwilling customers. It's a chain forcing millions of women, men and children to live in desperate poverty. If the chain was suddenly broken, many of the world's leading financial institutions could be plunged into chaos and bankruptcy. Poverty is no stranger to Latin America, but since 1982, the scale of human suffering has increased massively. For many, living standards have been halved in the attempt to pay huge debts to foreign banks. The fourfold rise in oil prices in the early 1970s left most third world countries struggling to pay their energy bills, bills which only added to the burden of payments on previous debts and the pressure for development. The banks, meanwhile, found themselves awash with money deposited by the oil-producing countries. Actively encouraged by Western governments, the world's leading banks, including Lloyds, Midland, Barclays and NatWest, began lending the oil money to developing countries. The offer was attractive: virtually unlimited money with few strings, and low interest rates and booming third world exports made payment deceptively easy. By the early 1980s, the banks had lent over $242 billion to Latin America, but by now the deal didn't look so good. Oil prices had again doubled, and Western governments' efforts to tackle inflation had sent interest rates rocketing and the world economy into recession. In the space of a couple of years, debtor countries found themselves paying real interest rates of over 20%, while the prices and markets for their exports began to collapse. In August 1982, Mexico suspended payment on its $80 billion debt. The financial world began to panic. All too late, bankers remembered the old maxim: if you owe the bank, you own the bank. The major banks had lent far more to a handful of Latin American countries than the banks themselves were worth. If Brazil, Argentina and Venezuela had joined Mexico's default, banks would have collapsed, bringing many other institutions down with them. Fortunately for the banks, the debtors were fearful of triggering such a crisis, turning instead to the International Monetary Fund and the commercial banks for new money. New money and an extension of time to pay were agreed, but at a heavy price. The new lending merely returned to the banks as interest, while economic orthodoxy demanded that the debtors slashed expenditure to balance their books. Food subsidies were cut, transport and other utility prices increased, development projects abandoned, and wages held behind spiraling inflation. The new measures cut local industry off from essential imports and investment. Almost overnight, Latin America lost years of economic growth. Since 1982, the number of Mexicans suffering from malnutrition has doubled to 33 million, over a third of the population. Half of all Bolivian children receive too little food, while the same hunger kills 300,000 Brazilian children every year. Over half the population in most countries are unemployed or underemployed, scratching an existence scavenging scrap, street selling, in domestic labour or in crime or prostitution. Child beggars are a part of the street scene. Brazilian trade unionist Lula insists,
"The Third World War has already started. Instead of soldiers, there are children dying. Instead of the destruction of bridges, there is the tearing down of factories, hospitals, and entire economies. It is a war over the foreign debt, a war which has its main weapon, interest."
Lula's war pushes women into the front line as victims and as combatants. Easily preventable diseases like diarrhea, influenza, TB, and heart disease cause nearly half the deaths of young women. The burden of childcare and domestic chores, in addition to work outside the home, means inflation and cuts in social spending hit women hardest.
"We can't afford meat anymore or even milk for our children. We have nothing to eat. We'd rather die of hunger here than in the streets. We are not here for ourselves. We are fighting for everyone, especially our children."
Macedonia Constanza and other members of the Bolivian Housewives Committee, who went on hunger strike in May 1985 against the price of milk, rice, kerosene and other necessities, won a temporary victory. Tension is rising throughout Latin America, with conflicts between the people and its governments intensifying. Bolivia's attempts to meet IMF conditions have closed half the tin mining industry, and troops were used in August 1986 to turn back a march on the capital, La Paz. A series of general strikes against austerity have shaken Argentina's newly democratic government of President Alfonsin. His economic policies cut wages by 27% in a year. In Brazil, landless peasants have clashed repeatedly with the private militia of large landowners, who, under 20 years of military rule, accumulated 342 estates covering 118 million acres, equal to the land owned by 2.5 million peasants. The debt brought little benefit to the poor, whose numbers rose even during the most hectic borrowing years. But rich elites, usually enjoying the protection of dictators, grew richer. Loans disappeared in corruption and inefficiency, with significant sums finding their way into foreign property and bank accounts. According to the World Bank, none of the $35 billion borrowed under Argentina's military government was invested in productive use. Banks financed hydroelectric power projects, but the irrigation and clean water needed by the poor was neglected. The poor may not have enjoyed the loans, but they are paying them back. No one has done more to make sure of that than the banks. Debt and profit payments have transferred $100 billion from Latin America to the wealthy nations of the world in 4 years. The big 4 British banks made £2.5 billion profit before tax in 1985, profits that would have been halved without payments of interest from Latin America. Both Lloyds and Midland have lent Latin America substantially more than they are worth. At the end of 1984, Lloyds had lent 2.5 times its value, and Midland over 3 times. Barclays and NatWest are heavily exposed. None would escape a serious default. Initial loans were reckless and uncontrolled, but the banks have worked hard to avoid taking the responsibility. Each major debtor has had to deal with a negotiating committee of banks acting on behalf of all the creditors. British banks have been represented on each, ensuring that wherever austerity has been negotiated, British banks have been there. Years of austerity and suffering have failed to solve the debt crisis. By the end of 1987, Mexico's debt, $80 billion when it first threatened default, will have reached $110 billion. Western governments now want Latin America to open its economies and resources to multinational companies, repeating the Chilean experiment, where the copper industry is just one open to multinational exploitation. How much longer can the people of Latin America endure a burden which makes them spend over a third of export earnings on payments to the banks? The demand to suspend payments on the external debt unites women's groups, unions, peasants' associations, and many churches across the region. In the background lies the ever-present threat that the military, driven back to barracks in part by the economic chaos they created, will once more impose harsh order on their people. Up to now, Western strategy has kept the debtors divided. The Cartagena group of debtors has failed to wield its potential concerted power. But the Peruvian government of Alan Garcia has limited debt payments to 10% of export earnings, and pressure for others to follow will grow. Cuban leader Fidel Castro has argued that the debt is unpayable and proposes a 20-year moratorium on payments.
My opinion is that no other alternative exists. To try to collect this debt, at least in Latin America, would be socially explosive.
The debt crisis may threaten the banks, but its victims are the poor. Only measures which improve their lives can be counted as solutions. Ending poverty and paying the banks all they are owed are incompatible aims. In Britain, the Profits Out of Poverty campaign is bringing home to the British public just how much responsibility British banks hold for so much suffering. The banks could reduce their demands for interest payments to the existing debt. The government could make them do it. But only public pressure can make it happen